Hello again, friends, and welcome to Madison BookBeat, your listener-sponsored community radio home for Madison authors, Madison topics, Madison book events, and Madison publishers. I'm your host, Stu Levitan. Our guest today is Danielle McGuire, author of the groundbreaking and award-winning book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, a new history of the civil rights movement from Rosa Parks to the rise of Black power. Danielle clicks on two criteria: as a double alum of the University of Wisconsin and a past presenter at the Wisconsin Book Festival. It was a little before midnight on September 3rd, 1944. A 25-year-old Black woman named Recy Taylor and two friends were walking home from church in rural Abbeville, Alabama, when a carload of 6 white boys with guns and knives kidnapped her, blindfolded her, and drove her to a wooded area outside of town, where they raped her repeatedly for more than 3 hours. Because Recy Taylor's family and friends knew that local law enforcement would not take the matter seriously, they contacted the NAACP office in Montgomery, and local President E.D. Nixon assigned his best investigator, a woman who had once lived in Abbeville before commencing a career in Black activism. Her name was Rosa Parks. What Rosa Parks did before and after she got to Abbeville, and the overwhelming impact of sexualized violence on the civil rights movement, is the business that occupies Danielle McGuire in this important book, as it has occupied her since she got her bachelor's and master's degree in Afro-American studies here in the late 90s, before getting her PhD from Rutgers. Danielle McGuire is a native of Janesville, Wisconsin, and she's been thinking and writing about the role of race in modern America since she read Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequalities, as a junior in high school in 1991. Her work has had an impact. At the Dark End of the Street won the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the Organization of American Historians and the Lillian Smith Award from the Southern Regional Council. Her Journal of American History essay, It Was Like We Were All Raped, Sexualized Violence, Community Mobilization, and the African American Freedom Struggle, won the A. Elizabeth Taylor Prize for Best Essay in Southern Women's History and was reprinted in Best Essays in American History. Perhaps most important, her work led to a formal apology from the state of Alabama to Recy Taylor and her family. Danielle is the editor with John Dittmer of Freedom Rights, New Perspectives on the Civil Rights Movement. She is currently at work on a book about the 1967 murder of 3 young Black men in the Algiers Motel in Detroit, which, like At the Dark End of the Street, will be published by Knopf. She lives in Detroit with her husband, 2 children, and a lasso poo. I had the pleasure of talking with Danielle McGuire on an earlier version of this show. It is a new pleasure to welcome her now to Madison BookBeat.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for coming back. The epigraph that opens the book is a line from the Swedish economist and Nobel laureate Gunnar Myrdal that, quote, "Sex is the principle around which the whole structure of segregation is organized." He wrote that in 1944, the same year that Recy Taylor was raped. How could something be so clear to a Swedish economist and not to America?
Well, I think partly, it's the outsider perspective. You can come in and look at a culture and see things that maybe, we weren't able to see. But I think if you were to ask African Americans, what was the thing that motivated, that animated, that drove white supremacy, that drove racial violence, that drove segregation, it was white people's absolute hysteria around the idea of interracial sex. It's what motivated white men to assault Black men and lynch them. It's what fueled efforts at segregation. It's what was used as a justification to commit violence against Black communities, even when there were really economic issues that whites were upset about, or jealousy, or just power. And it's what, of course, why Black women were largely unprotected throughout the United States, in the workplaces, in their homes, and on the roads when they're walking to or from school or church or anywhere. I'm not sure if anyone would have articulated it the same way he did, but I think everyone understood very clearly that white people's fear of interracial sex motivated the entire substructure and systematic workings of white supremacy and segregation.
Myrdal wrote that at a time when, as you note, more than half the race riots in America were based on unsubstantiated allegations of black men raping or even just flirting with white women. So was Myrdal referring mainly to that fear of something that wasn't going on, to the reality of white men raping black women? Was he referring to both?
Yeah, I think he was referring to all of it. I mean, it's hard to go back and look at any of the narratives of lynchings, and these were front page news stories, carnival like events, and not understand what was motivating white people's fears and what was motivating their violence. So I think. And also, 1944 is still, obviously before the Brown decision in 1954, it's 10 years earlier, but almost every single, race riot in the 1940s started because of a rumor of a black man attacking a white woman, like you mentioned. And when you look into those stories, none of that was really true. And on the flip side, if you were investigating those narratives, you would find in the black community similar narratives, but of white men attacking and assaulting black women or black mothers in particular, like was the case in Detroit in 1943. So I think my sense is that any even cursory survey of, America's history of racial violence, if you're just reading about it, you get the overwhelming sense that there's a problem that white people have with the idea of interracial sex, and that they're using it to commit violence or to justify their violence.
It seems this single sentence from Myrdal has been an animating principle for your academic life since the 1990s. Do you remember the first time you read Myrdal and your reaction to that sentence?
I don't remember it exactly. It wasn't like a lightning bolt out of the blue. But I do remember feeling like it encapsulated a lot of other studies in a single sentence. It must have been in graduate school because that's when I would have read Myrdal. And, as someone who has been taught that every sentence should be like a spear, it's singular, it has a point, it's sharp, right? That's the sentence. And so I think it was more of like an editor's instinct that said, like, he's got it, because he doesn't spend, an overwhelming amount of time in the book talking about that, as I recall, and it's been a few years since I've read it, but that's the thing. And when you study African American history, and you really single out the cases, the Wilmington, riot of 1898, East St. Louis in 1919, Chicago, Detroit, 1943, and so on. Like, that's the singular story that keeps coming out again and again. So I think for me, it's just it synthesized all of this other work that I had been exposed to and that I had read, and it made perfect sense. And it made more sense. I think most people see it as a way to think about lynching, right? And because of the work that I was doing, the research that I was doing, I started to see how it was much broader than that when you take into consideration Black women's experiences and lived reality. And so it had more power to me, probably because I was looking at it, through more of a gendered lens than maybe previous scholars had.
You mentioned graduate school. You want to give a brief shout out to Craig Warner here?
Oh, Craig Warner is I love Craig Warner. And when I say I love him, I don't mean it like, the way some people might say, oh, I love that person. I mean, I really love Craig Warner. He is a fantastic scholar and outstanding teacher. He is a marvelous human being. He has, I was so intimidated of him when I first was in the graduate program, afraid to talk to him, really. Afraid that he would think that I was dumb, or that he would see through my, like see through me and see the simpleton that I really was. But he has always only ever been embracing and expansive and welcoming and thoughtful. I mean, anyway, I just love him. It was such a thrill to be able to help celebrate his work and his tenure at the university a couple years ago at the conference that was held for him and, for the community that he's created. And I left there feeling like I was so hungry for that community that I didn't have anywhere else except Madison. But I was reminded that they're still there. The community's still there, and it's largely because Craig built it. He's just magnificent. So, hey, Craig.
The kind of sexual violence of the 40s and the 50s that you write about, it seems to me is largely gone and has been replaced by police violence. Have we gone from Recy Taylor to Breonna Taylor?
It's the same violence. And as much as I'd like to say things have changed, I'm not sure. So many of the studies that look at, violent policing includes studies about police officers sexually assaulting the people they arrest. And they do that largely to people who they consider are inconsequential to our society, or people who they think don't matter. And that was most clear in the case of Daniel Holtzclaw, a case from, I think, 2015 in Oklahoma City. This is a police officer with the Oklahoma City Police Department who identified as white, who targeted Black women who he knew were vulnerable in lots of different ways. They had intersecting oppressions. They were Black. They were maybe dependent on drugs or alcohol. They were maybe had previous records. They were in the system in some way or another. They were maybe involved in sex work. Or in one case, maybe it was none of that at all. And it was just a Black woman who was a grandmother who was in the neighborhood where Holtzclaw patrolled. And he went there, he went in search of Black women, and he would pull them over and he would threaten to arrest them unless they performed sexual acts on him. And he would rape them. And some women came forward to report it. Their reports weren't taken seriously until an older woman, not that old really, I mean in her late 50s, Janine Ligon, came forward and told a female officer what had happened. And she had heard, a couple of things in the department about, other women reporting. She followed up, and he ended up, with 18 allegations or more. And was finally convicted, of multiple counts of sexual assault. And that's the rule, not the exception, right? When it comes to officers who behave badly, they will look for people who they can do this kind of stuff, use their power against people who are less powerful than them and people who they think are powerless in society. And overwhelmingly, it's women of color. Right? It's Black women, it's Indigenous women, it's Latinx, Latinas. And so I think that when we leave out the testimonies of Black women who have been sexually assaulted by police, when we limit police violence to physical violence or shootings, we don't have a real grasp of what's actually going on and the depth to which the brutality exists. So during Recy Taylor's time, police officers could just as easily physically assault a Black woman as they could sexually assault them. And that was part of my point in trying to look at police brutality, that it had a racialized violence to it, but it also had a sexualized violence to it. And that's part of what Kimberly Crenshaw talks about when she's talking about intersecting oppressions, right? that there are multiple ways of being oppressed, and they intersect in the bodies of, particularly women of color.
We're talking with Danielle McGuire. Her book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. Well, let's go back to Recy Taylor in 1944. What those 6 white men did to Recy Taylor was horrific, but up to the time that Rosa Parks enters the narrative, was there anything unique about it? Was it at all unusual for white men to rape Black women and get away with it?
I don't think so. From my research, it appeared to me that it was ritualistic, meaning young white boys could get instruction on how to do this from older white men. They might have heard their fathers or their grandfathers or their uncles laugh and joke about having, getting a Black woman. They all see, every case that I looked at was like similar. It was like they had a playbook. They knew that they could pick someone up off the road at night and say to them, like, I'm going to, we're making a citizen's arrest. We're going to take you to the sheriff's office. And of course, that's not what they were doing. They were looking for someone to assault. And when they were looking for someone to assault, or even just to have, they wouldn't say we're looking for someone to assault. They would say, we're looking for someone to party with. We're looking for someone to have a sexual experience with. They almost always meant Black women and girls. And so to me, on paper, in the archives, these narratives that came up again and again and again, they all look the same. And that's what made me think it was both ritualistic and a holdover from the period of slavery, that these were practices that were normalized in places where Black people were enslaved. And when slavery ended, the legal infrastructure of that system, might have disappeared, but the practices that were embedded within it remained. And so, throughout the Jim Crow period, white men felt that they could, whenever they wanted to, have sex with a Black woman, and they did what it took to take them, to get them. And Black mothers, grandmothers, aunts, sisters, they all instructed their daughters, their nieces, their friends on how to protect themselves from white men. It was that common. Like every young Black girl got, a talk. Like we talk about the talk for Black men, right, with police. Black girls also got the talk from Black mothers and grandmothers about how to protect themselves from the dangers of white men. And so I don't think what happened to Recy Taylor was at all unique. I think it was a part of a systematic, practice. And there are a ton of other cases that I uncovered. And I uncovered those cases, before so many newspapers and archives were digitized. And so I know that there are more cases out there just waiting to be discovered. But if you talk to Black families, and you talk to the older people and they're willing to open up to you, they'll tell you these stories. There are stories like this in every Black family that I talk to. So sadly, what happened to Recy Taylor was not unusual. What was unusual at the time in some ways was her willingness to speak out and the attention that her case got. That was unusual. Because her case really became an international cause. Getting justice for her became an international cause. And that had everything to do with World War II and the kind of Black activist network that and infrastructure that existed during that time. There was an opening, a possibility for justice in ways that there may not have been in the 1930s or the 1920s or the 1910s, or even later, in the 1950s. So yeah, there's some things that are very typical in her case, and some things that were unusual, but the rape itself was not.
The way all that international concern was largely generated was the Committee for Equal Justice for Recy Taylor, which the Chicago Defender called the most successful national campaign for racial justice since the Scottsboro trials. What exactly did that campaign do, and what did it accomplish?
So that campaign was really important. It did a lot of things. One, it brought sunlight to Abbeville, Alabama, right? It got press attention. And this is largely in the Black press. And the Black press is so important for this reason, because the white newspapers were not covering this. White newspapers were trying to cover these things up, right? So the Committee for Equal Justice, one of the first things they did was said, we need press attention. And at the time, that meant the Chicago Defender, it meant the Daily Worker, it meant the Baltimore Afro-American, maybe the Amsterdam News. And they got some press attention. That was important because it drew people in. People wanted to know what they could do. Well, the Committee for Equal Justice said, what you can do is we are going to pressure the governor of the state of Alabama. We're going to send thousands of postcards to the governor insisting that he do something to intervene in this case, right? They knew, for example, that there was a grand jury hearing, a few months after her, or about a month after her assault, and it was a farce of a hearing. They knew that only pressure from the top in Alabama could maybe do something about a county grand jury. So they sent thousands and thousands and thousands of postcards from all over the country, from around the world, and they demanded the governor intervene. The governor was worried that negative attention on Alabama was going to cause him some political problems. He knew what happened with Scottsboro, right? He didn't want there to be another Scottsboro in Alabama. He didn't want Alabama to have a negative reputation. This is at a time, of course, when they're starting to get big contracts from the federal government for military bases and stuff. And of course, it's at a time when we're fighting a war for democracy. So it's like all of the stars kind of aligned politically to create a wedge, an opening, a possibility. And the Committee for Equal Justice really tried to pry that wedge open the best they could. So they petitioned the governor. And because the governor was so afraid of Alabama getting another bad reputation, he actually decided, and this is Governor Chauncey Sparks, he's no integrationist, but he felt pressured enough that he assigned 2 private detectives to go down to Abbeville and look into what happened. And they went there and they interviewed the sheriff and they interviewed the young men who were implicated. They interviewed Recy Taylor and her family, and they wrote up a full report with all of the young men's testimonies about what happened and what the sheriff said they did versus what they really did. And they presented it to the governor and said, hey, we believe that the sheriff is lying when he said he arrested the young men and, that they paid a bond. We believe the young men did what Recy Taylor said they did. We believe Recy Taylor. So the governor, to his credit, ordered a second grand jury hearing. And that's really all he could do as governor, because the grand jury in the county had, the final say over whether or not a case would move forward into a full hearing or not. And so he ordered a second grand jury hearing that happened in January or February of 1945. And it was the same kind of farce. They did it because the governor told them to, but they were not going to find these young men guilty of raping a Black woman. And so that was it. The case was closed. But the Committee for Equal Justice brought Recy Taylor's story so much attention that what happened was all of these other cases started getting attention as well. And I think that Black organizations like the Southern Negro Youth Congress, like the NAACP, they started to get, letters from Black women, from NAACP leaders in their communities, from husbands and, fathers, saying, hey, this happened to my wife. This happened to my daughter. What can we do? And so you started to see a lot more testimony because of Recy Taylor's courage to speak out and the Committee for Equal Justice's willingness to make this a case. That's sort of nationally and in Alabama. But what the Committee for Equal Justice also did locally in Alabama was it helped to solidify an infrastructure of activism that existed in pockets around the state in small towns like Abbeville, but mainly in places like Montgomery and Birmingham. And it connected them and it gave them a communication network that they used again and again and again between 1944 and 1955 to try to win justice in cases where there was racial violence, in cases of sexual violence, and ultimately, it's the infrastructure that makes possible the Montgomery bus boycott.
And we will get to that in 1955 in a moment, but first, a couple more points on Recy Taylor. How did you become aware of her story to begin with and go about researching it?
So a lot of these cases are hard because there's no, not only are narratives of Black women invisible in our society, which is why we even have a Say Her Name movement, right? Where we talk about women like Breonna Taylor and what happened to them. But they're oftentimes, not in the archive either. Black women's experiences, their lives have in the past not been considered worthy of archival documentation. And so it's not like you could go to the Alabama Department of Archives and History and look up Recy Taylor, right? You have to come at these cases sideways and in creative ways. And, for me, the Recy Taylor story, I was looking for rape cases, and again, like, this is before newspapers were digitized. You couldn't just do a word search, and you had to be creative about how you would find it, partly because at the time, people didn't always use the word rape to describe a sexual assault. They would use a term like ravish or had their way with, right? Or attack, and you had to sort of figure out what really happened. So there was a brochure by the Civil Rights Congress, sort of leftist radical Black organization out of, I want to say, Detroit, that was so, they were so upset with the lack of a federal response to lynching in American history that they petitioned the United Nations for intervention, like, hey, we need help, UN. And they called this petition, this pamphlet, oh no, I'm forgetting the name of it. Anyway, they put out this pamphlet, and it's really like a compendium of all of these incidences of racial violence, mostly against men. 99% of the cases were against men. But there was one line in that pamphlet. It's called "We Charge Genocide." Sorry. There was one line in that pamphlet where it said the Committee for Equal Justice for Recy Taylor petitioned Governor Chauncey Sparks, right, in this case. That's really all it said. It didn't say anything about an assault or rape or sex or anything. And I thought, well, what happened? Who's Recy Taylor? What's the story? And so I went to Chauncey Sparks's papers. I thought, well, if they filed a petition, maybe it's in his files. I mean, what are the chances, right? The chances were almost zero, but I went anyway and I looked, and lo and behold, this is where I found his private investigation that I just talked about. It's where I found all those postcards that the committee had sent to him. There were 4 boxes of material on Recy Taylor's case in Chauncey Sparks's gubernatorial papers. I mean, like, why would you ever look in his papers for her, right? But there she was. And so that was a massive treasure trove of archival documentation of a crime against a Black woman, a sharecropper, whose story was literally erased from local white newspapers, and no white person in town would even acknowledge it, right? There was the evidence. And there was also the evidence when you put those postcards together very carefully, and you look at the addresses and you start to map out, where people live, you start to see a Black community that are neighbors, that belong to the same church, that belong to the same organizations like the NAACP, and you really physically see that Black activist infrastructure. And what was so amazing to me is that's where I started to see the names that I recognized from the Birmingham movement of 1963, from Selma of 1964 and 5, and from Montgomery, right? That's where I found, for example, a postcard signed by Rosa Parks. That's the first time I had a sense that Rosa Parks was even involved in this case. And so, that changed, that made me rethink everything I thought I knew about Rosa Parks. Number one, it made me say, wow, wait a second. Rosa Parks is involved in this case in 1944. I need to know more about her. And it made me say, she's eating Nixon's neighbor, and Johnny Carr is involved. Well, she was involved in the bus boycott. And and it made me say, wait a second, I think we've got this all wrong. I think there's more to the story, rather. Not that we've gotten it wrong, but that there's more to the story. And so that's how I went at Recy Taylor's case. And then from there, because the governor's papers included newspaper articles, I could go find the newspaper articles in their entirety. I could find, for example, Eugene Gordon, who wrote for the Daily Worker. I wanted to see if he had any notes on the case, and sure enough, he did. I went to find his archive in the Cuyahoga County Community College in upstate New York. They had an archive of Eugene Gordon's materials, and I found a ton of documents from the case that he. So these stories are, you can find them in the archive, but it's hard. And I didn't even talk to Recy Taylor, and this is pretty wild. I didn't even talk to Recy Taylor until I had written my dissertation, and I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of North Carolina, and I was giving a talk about my findings. And Recy Taylor's brother, Robert Corbett, her baby brother, was in the habit of searching for his sister's name online, because he had really made it his life's mission to find the men who assaulted her, to find some way to, punish them, and to protect his sister. And so he had, like, in his retirement, he had started researching his sister's case. And he Googled her name, and this would have been 2007. And when you Googled Recy Taylor's name in 2007, there was nothing on the internet, which is hard to believe, because today you can find all kinds of stuff. But then there was nothing. The only thing that would come up on the internet is recycling, RECY. And so he Googled her name, and my name came up. This was new for him, right? Wait, who is Danielle McGuire? And he saw that I was giving a talk about his sister, and that I had the date of her assault.
Oh, you just froze. Okay, you froze on, and I had the date of her assault.
Okay, so he was shocked when he Googled her name, because he saw a poster of announcing a talk I was giving, and it included the date of Recy Taylor's assault. And that boggled his mind, because they couldn't remember the dates. They couldn't find it in the newspapers. They knew it was 1944. They didn't remember when in 1944 it was. So he called the university and found me, and we had this incredible conversation. I had been looking for her, but I wasn't able to find her. She had remarried. She had changed her name twice. So I just couldn't find her. That's why I always tell women, keep your maiden name. But at the end of our conversation, and this would have been, I guess it was 2008. It was in the fall of 2008. At the end of our conversation, I said, Mr. Corbett, is your sister still alive? And he said, well, yeah, do you want to talk to her? And I said, oh my God, yes, I would love to. And so I talked to her by phone, shortly thereafter. And then I met with her on the day Barack Obama was inaugurated as president. And that's when, she really told me her whole story. And they took me around Abbeville and showed me where everything happened. They showed me all of the assailants' homes and their kin who still live there. And then Recy Taylor she filled in the gaps that the archive couldn't fill in. And they're the ones who told me about Rosa Parks coming to their house. And so I had the postcard, I had a hunch, But until I did that oral history, I didn't know the full extent of Rosa Parks's involvement. So that kind of came full circle in how I got into researching her case and found her and made those connections to Rosa Parks.
Don't you just love historical research? I mean,
it's so fun.
Isn't it the best?
It's so great.
We're talking with Danielle McGuire. Her book is At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. Well, let's get to Montgomery, Alabama in December 1955. First, set the stage for what it was like for Black women to ride the buses in Montgomery. It was more than just the hassle and the insult of where and when they could sit. There was pervasive sexual harassment and even assault on the buses. Why has that been written out of the narrative?
I think it's been written out of the narrative partly because the focus turned to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was an absolutely brilliant, incredible, dynamic 26-year-old speaker who came to town that year. And he kind of became, the spokesperson of the boycott, the public spokesperson. And newspapers covered him. And so the first draft of history, is usually newspaper coverage, and it goes on from there. And I think, there were stories of Black men being assaulted by bus drivers, veterans, having to pay up front and get on in the back and getting the doors shut on their legs and dragged through the streets. But there were also lots of stories about Black women. Now, part of this is just, I think, not always understanding or including sexual assault and harassment in our histories of racial violence. It's not looking at racial violence in an intersectional way, or white supremacy in an intersectional way, and the different ways it can affect different people based on their race, their gender, their sexuality, their ability or disability, their orientation, right? So I think that's part of why we didn't know. That a lot of historians for a long time didn't include sexual violence or harassment as a civil rights issue. But when I started looking at it, with the analytical lens of sexual violence as my tool, everywhere I looked, I saw sexual harassment and sexual assault. And everywhere I looked, Black women were testifying about it. When they filed complaints to the bus company, they talked about being touched inappropriately. They talked about bus drivers slapping them. They talked about bus drivers. One woman said they like to talk under folks' clothes. Right? You have to read between those lines a little bit to try to get at what she might mean. They complained that bus drivers flash them while they're standing on the corner. And they complained that those were spaces where other white men assaulted them, or where if they refused to do what the bus driver said, they would then call in the police, and the police would physically or sexually assault them, oftentimes both. So when I started reading the complaints about Black women's experiences on the buses, it wasn't just about where they sat. It wasn't just about paying in the front and entering at the rear. It was about the whole spectrum of abuse that they suffered on the buses, from bus drivers, from white men on the buses, passengers, and from police when they were called to the buses. And it was fundamentally a story of their inability to have bodily integrity, right? They could not move through the world without the threat and the very real possibility of being touched inappropriately, being assaulted, being hit, being bullied, being brutalized. And it often took on a sexualized and, of course, racialized undertone. So when I saw those complaints, and then I looked at Rosa Parks' experience with Recy Taylor in 1944, I said, well, what else was going on? What happened before the bus boycott that got Black women, that made Black women, so willing to walk off the buses? Because that's not easy to do if you have a job to get to, right? People, it's hot in Alabama in the summer. It's wet and kind of crappy in the winter. you don't want to walk to work 5 miles from the black side of town to the white side of town. And most of these women didn't have cars. So, riding the bus was something they had to do. Well, to get someone to give that up, you have to have a pretty compelling reason, right? And when I started to look at what motivated Black women to do that so quickly, it was because they had all these awful experiences on the buses with bus drivers and with policemen, and that there were a series of rape cases in the years leading up to the bus boycott that had mobilized the Black community, but particularly had mobilized Black women. And so by the time Claudette Colvin was assaulted on the bus and arrested, when Mary Louise Smith was arrested on the bus, and then finally when Rosa Parks was, they were just like, that's it, we're done. And normally they would have gone to E.D. Nixon and said, we want to do this. They didn't even wait for him. They were just like, to hell with E.D. Nixon. We don't care what he has to say. We are starting a boycott. This, of course, is Joanne Robinson, who said this. We are starting the boycott with or without the male leaders, and it's time for them to get behind us. We're going to do it, and this is the day we're doing it. And they did it. And then all the male leaders had to get behind them. They were afraid to do so at first, right? They were worried about backlash. They were worried about their jobs. They were worried about their lives. And so they got the new guy to do it. They were like, well, this guy's got nothing to lose. He's not connected to anyone. He hasn't been here that long. We'll get him to do it. And that, of course, is Martin Luther King. So yeah, we just, I think so often this story is taught in such simplistic ways. And that simple narrative of Rosa Parks being tired and sort of tiptoeing into history, and Martin Luther King giving a speech, and then white people saying, oh, he's a good speaker and he's right, and we should just change our power structure. That is totally ridiculous, but it's the narrative that gets repeated over and over and over again. And it's a narrative that in lots of ways, benefits white people. Makes white people feel good about the past. It makes white people think they did the right thing when they were called upon to do it. And it makes it, and it teaches everybody, that change happens without any real hard work or effort, right? That all you have to do is have tired feet or make a good speech, and whole hierarchies can come tumbling down. So anyway, I got off a little off, but
no, it's all one narrative. It flows together. But if ever there was a woman who was made for the moment, it was Rosa Macaulay Parks on that Cleveland Avenue bus that day. As you noted, she was not the first woman to be arrested for not complying with the bus driver's orders, but she was clearly the wrong woman. Why was she the wrong woman for them to arrest?
Well, there's lots of different reasons. So, number one, she was an activist. And she wasn't just an activist. She was a radical Black activist who was raised, in the shadow of her grandfathers, who was a Garveyite, who believed in armed resistance to the Ku Klux Klan, who refused to let, her mother refused to let her do domestic work. And the one time she did, she was nearly assaulted. And she testified about it later in a letter. She married her husband largely because he was a radical activist who had worked on behalf of Black people around the area. He kept a pistol in his pocket. She liked that about him. And when they first married, they were involved in the Scottsboro case and helping to defend the young men who were accused of rape, and who were innocent of that. And Rosa Parks talks about, having meetings in their little house in Montgomery, and she's so nervous, she's outside, and the whole, dining room table is full of guns. So Rosa Parks was an activist. She had worked for E.D. Nixon for many years, both as his assistant in the NAACP, when she became secretary in 1943, but also as his assistant in his work for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This was the largest all-Black union in the country, and that put him in touch with folks like A. Philip Randolph, who got the president integrate the military, for example. So, she's moving with some real powerful people and connected to a nationwide infrastructure of Black activists. She goes to Highlander the summer before she's arrested. She gets, training in nonviolent resistance. She is connected to Ella Baker. She's giving speeches at national NAACP conferences in 1946. I mean, she's the one, right? And she's quiet. So, she's not out there, yelling in audiences and causing a ruckus. She's very careful.
She's a respectable radical.
She's a respectable radical, and she's not causing trouble. She also is very light complected. And she is married, but she's childless, but she's married. That's important. She's a Christian woman who goes to church regularly. She doesn't have any bad marks against her. In other words, she's a sort of pure symbol of what happens to Black women when they're wronged by white supremacist violence, right? And, they chose her. Well, they didn't choose her. Joanne Robinson was like, that's it, we're doing it. But she worked better than the other plaintiffs, potential plaintiffs, like Claudette Colvin and Mary Louise Smith, because when E.D. Nixon, as head of the NAACP at the time, when he had to kind of figure out if he was going to throw his weight and his network behind a case, he had to make sure, especially in 1955, that they would play well in the press, that they wouldn't become smeared as a communist, right? That they wouldn't be considered promiscuous, that they wouldn't violate any of the racial or gender or political norms of the time. They were kind of a safe figure. Now, Rosa Parks is radical, so she's not that safe, but white people don't know that about her, right? Because they don't see Black people in all of their splendor and all the things that they do. They only think they do. So they see Rosa Parks as a seamstress, a quiet woman, soft-spoken, very respectable. So, and E.D. Nixon knows how white people see Rosa Parks, and he knows, for example, how white people will treat Claudette Colvin, a young girl who, as her mother put it, took a tumble and became pregnant, who was dark complected, or Mary Louise Smith, who was from the wrong side of the Black community, whose father had a drinking problem, who, he knew the press would tear them apart. He knew that they would be viewed by white people as unfit, and that they wouldn't see them as worthy of respect or of equality on the buses, right? Rosa Parks was really different in that way. So it's kind of a cruel triage on who, like, the NAACP will put up as a symbol of injustice and oppression, but that's what they did. And Rosa Parks was perfect because she was ready. She had been doing the work. She was active in the Black community. She was active with Black women's groups. She was connected to this network, and so she was really, the perfect person to get arrested. It makes it seem like she planned it in some ways, but she didn't. She didn't. In fact, she had boycotted that particular driver for years and years and years because she thought he was a real jerk, and she didn't want to ride his bus, and she didn't. But that day, it was busy. It was near the holidays. She had worked a long shift as professional tailor, and she got on the bus, and then she realized it was this schmuck, and she thought, okay, well, whatever. And then that's when it happened. And so she was ready. So there's so many things that you have to take into consideration. When we look back on that time period, it would be easy to say, E.D. Nixon was classist, or E.D. Nixon was biased against darker skinned African Americans, and that's why he didn't want Mary Louise Smith, or that E.D. Nixon, really vilified Claudette Colvin. But E.D. Nixon, in his defense, he was dealing with a culture in which we had just had the Brown decision in 1954, which, created a massive white backlash to the idea of integration. It helped fuel the rise of the white citizens councils, which were like uptown Ku Klux Klans. It helped respawned the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama, which got very violent in Birmingham, but was just as violent in Montgomery. And it's in the midst of the Cold War, right? So he understood very clearly all of these sort of swirling political forces that he had to work against in order to make a case that what happened to Rosa Parks was not only wrong individually, but that the whole system was wrong and needed to be overturned. And so, you know, we have to be very careful how we look at these past cases and not cast our judgment on them, but think about the kinds of forces they're working against at the time. And when you think about those things, you think about how brilliant their strategy really was, and how Rosa Parks, as a radical, you know, reworks her own ideology in lots of ways to fit into that kind of position where the white media can see her as this like helpless old lady with tired feet, and the Black community knows just how radical she really is. And that's a pretty incredible feat.
We are almost out of time. We're not going to get to the 1959 case in Tallahassee, which you based your master's thesis on, in which 4 young white men were actually convicted and sentenced to life in prison. We're not going to get to the sexualization that the white Alabamans put on the march from Selma to Montgomery. We're not going to get to Viola Liuzzo, but just to finish one last bit about Recy Taylor. As I mentioned in the introduction, the Alabama legislature a few years ago apologized to Recy Taylor and her family in a joint resolution declaring its, quote, profound regret for what it called its, quote, morally abhorrent and repugnant failure to prosecute the crimes against her. How significant was that?
It was really significant and not significant enough. It was really significant in the sense that it meant a great deal to Recy Taylor and her family. She told an interviewer after the book came out that all she ever wanted was an apology. And a young woman listening to that interview heard that and started a petition online. It got thousands of signatures, and that's what really prompted the apology. It mattered. It mattered that the state legislature had to say her name and had to put on paper for all of time that they failed her in this case. It's not significant enough in the sense that, you know, the men who did this to her were never punished. The years of suffering that she endured can never be compensated, right? There's no reparations for this. In some ways, there's no real restorative justice. It's an important and significant step, but it's not what she deserves. It's not the only thing she deserves, right? I think real justice would have looked like reparations, would have looked like at least naming her assailants and saying they're guilty, right? Something more than just an apology. But the apology was a start. At the very least, like I said, they had to say her name. And for years and years and years, what happened to her, her testimony, what she suffered, what she endured, her life was disappeared from the narrative and was ignored. And so that acknowledgement is real. You know, to acknowledge Black people's suffering is very important in a society that almost consistently refuses to even see it. So it mattered. It mattered to her, and I was happy that it mattered to her. You know, if it wouldn't have mattered to her, I think we would have tried to fight harder. But she was happy with that. I think she would have appreciated more, of course, but it meant something to her.
Well, I'm afraid that is all the time we have. We're going to have to leave it there. My thanks to Danielle McGuire. Again, the book is At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape, and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement from Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power. And as I say, there's lots of the narrative that we did not get to. Next week on Madison BookBeat, Sarah M. Broom in conversation about her National Book Award-winning memoir, The Yellow House. For now, on behalf of all of us here at Madison BookBeat, I'm Stu Levitan. Thank you for listening. And now, as Ben Sidran plays us out with a bit of Little Sherry, please do stay tuned for Alex Wilding White and All Around Jazz. You are listening to WORT 89.9 FM Madison, listener-sponsored community radio. Okay, now
Wonderful.